Lieutenant Anna Reeves sat alone in the observation deck of the starship Voraan, staring out at the endless stretch of stars. The vastness of space was beautiful, but to her, it often felt like a reflection of her own isolation, endless, cold, and quiet. She was the only human on the ship, a biologist assigned to the Predaari research fleet through a peace and knowledge exchange program. The Predaari were once considered the most dangerous species in the galaxy, towering, clawed, with sharp teeth and deep rumbling voices that could shake the walls. Humanity had feared them for generations, but over time that fear turned into understanding and then cooperation. Now they worked together, studying life across distant worlds. Anna had dreamed of space since she was a child, but she had never imagined feeling so small in it. The Predaari crew towered over her. Even their smallest members were twice her size. When they walked down the halls, the metal floor echoed under their heavy steps. Their voices rumbled like thunder, their movements sharp and precise. They were warriors by birth, disciplined and powerful, yet they carried themselves with a strange grace, like lions who had learned patience. The first few weeks had been difficult for Anna. Every time a Predaari leaned too close or let out a low growl while talking, her instincts screamed to run. But slowly, she began to see beyond their frightening appearance. She saw how carefully they handled fragile samples in the lab, how they bowed slightly in respect when passing one another in the corridors, and how their laughter, deep and rough, filled the ship with warmth when they shared stories at dinner. Still, no matter how kind they were, Anna couldn't shake the feeling of being different. They called her Small Star, a nickname meant to honor her curiosity and light, but it only reminded her how tiny she seemed among giants. In the common dining hall, her voice was barely heard above their deep chatter. When they gathered in groups, she often stood at the edges, notebook in hand, pretending to study when in truth she simply didn't know how to join in. The Predaari respected her, that much she knew, but respect wasn't the same as belonging. Her work was focused on emotional intelligence, studying how two very different species could understand one another's body language and feelings without words. The Predaari didn't cry or smile like humans did. Their expressions were subtle. The slow lowering of their ears, the gentle tilt of their heads, the soft rumble in their chest that meant comfort rather than anger. Anna spent hours each day observing these details, recording everything in her logs. She believed that if humans and Predaari could truly read each other's emotions, there would be no reason for fear to ever return. But late at night, when the rest of the crew slept, the silence of the ship became unbearable. She would wander the hallways, listening to the steady hum of the engines, feeling the cold metal under her bare feet. Sometimes she stood before the large viewing window watching distant stars drift past. The galaxy was full of life, full of connection, yet she had never felt more alone. There were moments when she longed for the sound of a human voice, for laughter that didn't echo off steel walls. One evening, while finishing her reports, she overheard two Predaari engineers speaking softly nearby. "The human," one said, his tone gentle, "works harder than any of us, but she carries sadness in her scent." The other grunted in agreement. "She hides it behind smiles. Small Star burns bright, but even bright things fade when left alone." Anna had paused, her chest tightening. They cared. They noticed. It was the first time she realized that maybe she wasn't as invisible as she thought. That night, she returned to her cabin and wrote in her journal, "Perhaps understanding doesn't begin with research. Perhaps it begins with being seen." As the ship drifted quietly through space, she lay on her bunk, listening to the distant hum of engines, and wondered if someday the distance between her and the Predaari would feel a little smaller. If someday, she might truly belong among the stars. Life aboard the Voraan slowly began to feel less foreign to Anna. But one surprise she hadn't expected came in the form of the youngest members of the crew, the Predaari cubs. There were 6 of them in total, small by their species standards, though each one still stood as tall as Anna's shoulder. Their parents, all part of the ship's crew, had brought them aboard as part of a cultural learning program. The Predaari believed that young ones learned best through experience, not books, so the cubs were allowed to explore the ship and observe the work of adults. From the very first day they saw Anna, they were fascinated. She was the only human they had ever met, and her smaller frame, smooth skin, and soft voice seemed completely alien to them. Wherever she went, they followed, sneaking behind cargo containers, peeking around corners, and chittering to each other in their guttural but oddly musical language. At first, Anna didn't notice them. She was often too busy in her lab, examining plant samples from distant moons or taking notes on the Predaari crew's emotional behavior. But one afternoon, as she walked through the long metallic corridor toward the observation deck, she heard a soft clicking sound behind her. When she turned around, there was nothing there. She shrugged and continued walking, but a few steps later, the sound returned, faint giggles mixed with the tapping of claws on the floor. Spinning around quickly, she caught sight of a small tail disappearing behind a stack of supply crates. "I can see you," she said playfully, though she knew they probably couldn't understand. Silence followed for a few seconds. Then two wide golden eyes peeked from behind the crates. Anna knelt down slowly, trying not to frighten the little one. "It's all right," she said softly, smiling. The cub tilted its head curiously, sniffing the air before stepping out. Its fur shimmered under the ship's lights, a mix of bronze and silver. Soon, two more cubs joined, clicking and chirping to one another. One of them reached out, gently touching the sleeve of her uniform as if to confirm she was real. Anna laughed quietly. "Yes, I'm real," she said, even though she knew they couldn't understand her words. Still, something in her tone seemed to calm them. They mimicked her laugh, a low, rumbling sound, and then darted away down the corridor, their tails swishing like playful shadows. After that day, the cubs began appearing everywhere. When she ate breakfast in the galley, she'd feel eyes watching from under the tables. When she worked in the greenhouse bay, she'd catch glimpses of small figures hiding between the hydroponic plants. Once, one of them even brought her a shiny screw it had found, dropping it proudly at her feet like a gift. She accepted it with a smile and thanked the cub, who puffed its chest in pride before scampering away. They reminded her of children back on Earth, full of curiosity, mischief, and innocence. The adult Predaari often apologized for their behavior, explaining that the cubs had never seen a human before and didn't mean any harm. Anna assured them it was fine. In truth, she found their company comforting. Their laughter filled the ship's cold metal halls with a sense of life that she had been missing. She began leaving small drawings taped to the walls, simple pictures of earth animals or flowers. By the next morning, the drawings were always gone, replaced by little sketches from the cubs, clumsy but adorable, drawn in thick black ink. Communication between them was mostly gestures and smiles. Sometimes she would wave and they would mimic her. Other times they'd bring her trinkets or make chirping sounds that she started to recognize as greetings. Though they came from a species once feared for their hunting instincts, these young Predaari were far from threatening. They were curious, brave, and full of warmth. One evening, as the ship drifted through the quiet stretch of space, Anna sat in the observation deck reading her notes. When she looked up, she saw 3 cubs sitting a few feet away, staring out at the stars with her. None of them spoke. They simply sat together watching the galaxy move. In that quiet moment, Anna realized something. Even in a place filled with towering predators and endless darkness, kindness could take the smallest, most unexpected shape. The cubs, wild in spirit yet gentle in heart, were no longer just observers. They were her friends. The hum of the engines was the only sound in Anna's cabin that night. Outside the wide viewing window, stars shimmered faintly, their light flickering like dying embers across the endless black sky. The ship, Voraan, glided silently through a field of fading suns, beautiful but haunting. Anna sat at her small desk, sipping lukewarm tea as she organized her notes from the day's experiments. It had been an ordinary evening, calm and predictable, until her communicator beeped softly, a message from Earth. Her heart lifted for a moment. Messages from home were rare. Transmission delays across the vast distance made them difficult. She pressed play, expecting to see her sister's usual cheerful face. But as the screen flickered to life, she immediately knew something was wrong. Her sister looked pale and tired, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Anna, it's about Mom," she began, pausing to steady herself. "She passed away last night, peacefully in her sleep." The words felt heavy, slow, almost unreal. Anna froze. Her breath caught, and she stared blankly at the screen as her sister continued to speak, her words muffled by the ringing in Anna's ears. She caught fragments. She wasn't in pain. The doctors tried. She talked about you, but the rest faded into a blur. The message was short, just a few minutes long, but it felt endless. When it ended, silence filled the room again. The communicator light blinked once, then dimmed. Anna sat motionless for several seconds, her body stiff, her hands shaking slightly. She had known this moment would come eventually. Her mother had been sick for months, her health fading like a candle burning too long. But knowing didn't make it easier. The finality of it, the idea that she would never hear her mother's voice again, hit her like a wave breaking over cold rock. Her chest tightened, her throat ached, and before she could stop herself, tears began to fall. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to muffle the quiet sobs that escaped her lips. She slid down from the chair, sinking to the floor beside her bed. The small cabin suddenly felt too small, too quiet, as if the air itself had thickened with grief. Light from the stars cast faint shadows across her face. Every part of her wanted to go home, to be with her family, to say goodbye. But Earth was months away. There was no shuttle, no quick return. Out here, she was light years from the world that had once been her home, surrounded by beings who couldn't even cry the way she did. Her mind drifted to memories. Her mother's hands tending to flowers in their small garden, her laughter at the dinner table, the way she'd always call her, "my brave star chaser." That nickname echoed in Anna's head now, painful and sweet all at once. She had promised her mother she'd make her proud, that she'd go out into the stars and do something meaningful. And she had. But at that moment, it didn't feel like enough. It felt like she had traded closeness for distance, love for silence. After a while, the tears slowed, leaving only a deep ache in her chest. She turned off the communicator, unable to look at the message again. The darkness of her room seemed to close in around her. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling up on the floor, and let her body tremble quietly. The hum of the engines became a dull lullaby, a sound she had once found comforting, but now only reminded her of how far she was from everything she loved. For the first time since joining the Voraan, Anna felt completely and utterly alone. The walls of the ship that had once protected her now felt like barriers, keeping her trapped in a world where no one spoke her language of grief. She buried her face against her arms, whispering into the quiet, "I wish you could see me now, Mom." Her voice cracked as she said it, fading into the empty air. Then, as the stars outside flickered faintly, she closed her eyes and let the tears fall again until exhaustion finally pulled her into restless sleep. The night was calm on the Voraan. The ship drifted silently through space, its engines humming like a heartbeat in the distance. Most of the crew had already retired to their quarters, and the long corridors were dimly lit, glowing faintly blue under the soft light of the control panels. In one of those hallways, two young Predaari cubs were playing, their claws clicking lightly against the floor as they chased each other around a set of cargo containers. They giggled in their own low, rumbling way, a sound that echoed softly through the quiet ship. They were supposed to be asleep, but curiosity had led them wandering again. Everything on the ship fascinated them, the blinking lights, the strange hum of the walls, and most of all, the small human they had grown to admire. They called her their tiny star friend. To them, she was unlike anyone else, soft-skinned, gentle-voiced, and always carrying that strange scent of sweetness and something they couldn't name. The cubs loved to peek into her lab when she worked, their bright golden eyes watching from behind the door. She had once shared a piece of chocolate with them, and ever since, they had followed her everywhere, waiting for another piece of that miracle food. But tonight, something different drew their attention. As they passed by her quarters, a sound reached their sharp ears. Faint, strange, and full of something that made their fur stand on end. It wasn't the steady rhythm of machines or the whisper of air vents. It was a sound they had never heard from her before. They stopped and listened closely. The sound came again, soft and broken. A human sound, but not like her laughter. It was heavier, full of hurt. The taller cub tilted his head, confused. "Why does our tiny star friend make that noise?" he whispered in their rough, growling language. The smaller cub frowned, his ears flattening. "It sounds wrong. It sounds like pain." Quietly, they crept toward the small viewing window outside her door. Peering through the glass, they saw her sitting on the floor, her face hidden in her hands. Her shoulders trembled. Wet lines ran down her cheeks, tears, though the cubs didn't understand what they were. They looked at each other, unsure what to do. Among the Predaari, sorrow wasn't shown through tears. Their kind expressed pain through low growls that resonated deep in their chests, or by huddling close to one another until the sadness passed. The sight of someone sitting alone, shaking, made the cubs feel uneasy. They pressed their small faces closer to the window, watching her quietly. She looked so small in that room, so fragile compared to the strong warriors and towering scientists they knew. "She is hurting," the smaller cub said finally, his voice soft. "Humans cry when their hearts break," said the older one, repeating something one of the adults had once told him. "But no one should cry alone." For a long moment they stood there, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim corridor light. Then, without another word, the older cub gave a quiet growl, a sound that in their language meant together. The smaller one nodded quickly. They couldn't help her with words. They didn't know the human way to comfort someone, but they could do something else. Their instincts told them that when someone was in pain, you didn't leave them. You brought warmth, you brought presence, you brought comfort. With that silent understanding, they turned and padded down the corridor, their tails brushing lightly against the metal floor. They moved quickly, disappearing around the corner as the hum of the engines filled the space behind them. Inside her room, Anna still sat in the darkness, unaware that anyone had seen her tears. But out in the corridors of the ship, two little hearts had already made a decision. They didn't know exactly how to help their human friend, but they knew one thing for sure. When someone you care about is hurting, you don't walk away. And with that shared promise, the cubs began their quiet mission, their small claws tapping softly as they hurried off to find what little comfort they could offer her. The two Predaari cubs moved quickly down the long metallic hallway, their small feet making soft tapping sounds against the floor. The ship was quiet, most of the crew asleep, and the faint hum of the engines followed them like a steady heartbeat. They didn't have to speak to one another. Both already knew what they wanted to do. Their tiny star friend, the human who always smiled at them and offered kind gestures, was hurting. They had seen her cry, something that confused and saddened them deeply. The Predaari didn't cry tears. Their kind showed pain with low growls or by leaning against each other for comfort. But they understood sadness when they saw it, and in their simple, childlike way, they wanted to make it better. The older cub stopped near his sleeping quarters first. He climbed onto a low bunk and reached into a small storage crate tucked beside it. From inside, he pulled out a glowing orb the size of his palm. It emitted a warm, golden light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. It was his favorite nightlight, the one his mother had given him to keep the shadows away when he was small. For a moment he hesitated. He loved this light, but he remembered the way the human's face looked. Lonely, full of silent pain. He pressed the orb against his chest for one last moment, then tucked it carefully under his arm. "She needs it more," he whispered quietly to himself. The smaller cub followed close behind, but instead of heading to his quarters, he darted into the communal room where the crew gathered to eat and talk. On a high shelf near the doorway hung a small charm made of feathers and beads. It was old and faded, but special, a gift from his mother when he was first brave enough to climb the learning mast during training. It symbolized courage and comfort, a reminder that he could face anything without fear. He reached up, tugged it down carefully, and held it in his claws. "For the tiny one," he murmured. so she feels brave again. Soon they were joined by another cub who had overheard their quiet movements. Without needing to ask why, he joined in. He went straight to the recreation bay, where soft blankets and cushions were stored for resting between shifts. He dragged one across the floor, a thick, soft fabric woven with tiny silver threads that shimmered in the dim light. It was heavy for him, but he didn't stop. The others helped, pulling it along together, their little claws gripping the edges. The blanket smelled faintly of lavender oil from the cleaning station. Soothing, warm and comforting. Even the smallest cub on the ship, who had been hiding behind a storage crate, peeked out and saw what they were doing. He didn't have much to give. His only treasure was a small piece of polished metal he carried everywhere. It was round and shiny, smooth from years of rubbing between his claws. He had found it as a newborn and refused to part with it, believing it brought him luck. Now he held it up, his big golden eyes serious. "I give this," he said softly, and the others nodded in respect. They didn't question their plan or talk about it. Words weren't needed. One by one, the cubs added their chosen gifts to a small pile near the end of the corridor: a warm light, a charm for courage, a soft blanket, and a piece of metal polished by love and time. Each object carried a story, a feeling, a piece of their hearts. They didn't understand humans completely, but they knew what it meant to care. When they looked at the little pile of treasures, they all felt something stir inside them: pride, affection, and hope that their tiny star friend would understand what they were trying to say without words. The older cub looked toward the direction of her cabin, his fur bristling slightly with determination. "We bring them to her now," he said softly, his voice low but firm. The others nodded, their golden eyes glowing in the half-light. Then, gathering the items in their arms, they began their quiet journey back through the sleeping ship, carrying their gifts like a promise to bring a little light back to the one who had always shared her warmth with them. The ship had gone quiet for the night. The long corridors of the Voraan were bathed in a dim silver-blue glow, and only the low hum of the engines filled the air. The adult Predaari were asleep or working in their private stations, leaving the ship in a rare, peaceful silence. In the midst of that stillness, 4 small figures crept through the hallway, their soft feet barely making a sound. The cubs moved carefully, their arms full of the treasures they had gathered: a glowing orb, a feathered charm, a folded blanket, and a small piece of polished metal that caught the faint light. Their eyes gleamed with determination and nervous excitement. They knew it was time to visit their tiny star friend. They reached the end of the corridor, where the door to Anna's quarters stood closed. The older cub pressed his ear against it, listening. There was no sound from inside, no movement, just quiet. He looked at the others and gave a small nod. The door was unlocked. The human never locked it. With a soft hiss, it slid open halfway. A sliver of light spilled into the dark hallway, and for a moment, they all froze. Inside, Anna sat near the window, her small figure outlined by the pale blue glow of distant stars. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face was turned toward the glass where endless space stretched on forever. The faint reflection of her eyes showed the remnants of tears, though she wasn't crying anymore. The cubs hesitated, unsure of what to do now that they were actually standing at her door. The older one took a cautious step forward, clutching the glowing orb to his chest. His tail twitched nervously. "Go," whispered the smaller cub in their deep, rolling tongue. "She needs light." That gave him courage. Slowly, he padded across the floor until he stood beside her knee. Anna didn't notice him at first. Her mind was somewhere far away, still lost in grief. Then he let out a soft chirp, a small, gentle sound that barely broke the silence. She looked down, startled. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw him standing there, holding out the orb with both hands. The golden light bathed her face, soft and warm. She blinked at it, then at him, not sure what was happening. The cub made a tiny noise, not words, just a sound that meant comfort in his language, and set the glowing orb beside her. Before she could speak, another cub stepped forward. This one carried the large silver-threaded blanket they had dragged across the ship. He walked carefully, his small claws clicking lightly against the floor. When he reached her, he climbed up onto the edge of the seat and draped the blanket gently over her shoulders. The fabric was warm from being carried, and the lavender scent reached her nose immediately. Her eyes began to sting again, but this time it wasn't from pain. The third cub, the smallest of all, approached last. He held his polished piece of metal carefully in his tiny claws, as if afraid it would fall apart. He hesitated for a long moment before crouching near her feet and placing it on the floor. The small trinket glinted in the starlight, reflecting soft flashes of gold and blue. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of something pure, love in its simplest form. Anna stared at it, speechless. Her lips trembled, and her eyes filled with tears again, but now her chest felt lighter. The sadness was still there, but it was surrounded by something else. Warmth. The cubs didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They stood there quietly, their heads tilted as they watched her, their golden eyes soft and full of concern. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Anna slowly reached out a shaking hand and placed it gently on the nearest cub's head. His fur was soft and warm under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The cub let out a low purr, a sound so deep and soothing it filled the whole room. The others joined in, rumbling softly, their way of showing comfort. Tears slid down her cheeks again, but this time they weren't from grief alone, they were from gratitude. She wasn't alone anymore. Around her, 4 little beings from another world had come together to remind her of something she had almost forgotten, that kindness doesn't need to be spoken or understood to be felt. Under the gentle glow of the orb and the shimmer of the stars outside, the human and the cubs sat together in silence, their hearts speaking the same quiet language of care. The soft rumble of the cubs' voices filled the small cabin like a quiet song. Their chittering wasn't loud, but it carried through the corridor, a gentle, vibrating sound that reached the sharp ears of the adult Predaari nearby. One by one, they began to stir from their quarters, curious as to why the cubs were awake past ship night. A tall engineer was the first to appear, stepping into the hallway with a puzzled expression. When he saw the door to the human's cabin slightly open, golden light spilling into the corridor, he frowned in confusion and approached silently. Peering through the doorway, his eyes widened at what he saw inside. There was the human, sitting near the window wrapped in a silver-threaded blanket, her eyes still red from tears. Around her, the cubs sat quietly, their tails curled neatly around their legs, the glowing orb casting a warm light on all of them. It was such a strange sight. Young Predaari gathered around a fragile human, comforting her in their own way. The engineer had seen many things during his long career aboard ships, battles, storms, near disasters, but he had never seen this. His first instinct was to step forward and scold the cubs for disturbing a crew member, but the moment he heard the low, soft purrs filling the room, he froze. There was something sacred about it, something he didn't want to interrupt. A few moments later, 2 more adults arrived, whispering to one another, their deep voices barely audible. "What are they doing?" one asked. The other shook her head slowly. "They're comforting her?" she said in disbelief. Soon a small group had gathered by the door, adults of different ranks, watching silently. Even the ship's commander, a large and imposing figure with dark, ridged fur and eyes that usually missed nothing, appeared at the end of the hallway. He was known for his strict discipline and rarely showed emotion, but when he stepped forward and looked inside, even he went still. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing as he took in the sight before him. Inside, Anna hadn't noticed the onlookers yet. She was too focused on the little ones in front of her. Their purring filled her cabin, low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. It vibrated through the air, into her chest, and slowly quieted the ache that had been tearing at her since the message from home. She brushed her hand gently over the nearest cub's head and smiled faintly, her tears finally slowing. Her voice came out as a whisper, fragile but sincere. "Thank you." The cub nearest to her blinked, his ears twitching. He didn't understand the words completely, but he recognized the tone, gratitude, warmth, love. He tilted his head and let out a low rumble that tried to mimic her voice. "Thaku." he said clumsily, his deep tone garbling the syllables. The sound was imperfect but full of effort. Anna laughed softly through her tears, and that sound, that small human laugh mixed with the rumbling purrs of the cubs, wrapped around the whole room like light. At the doorway, the commander exhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling with a strange emotion he hadn't felt in years. He looked at his officers, who stood in silent awe. "Do not disturb them," he murmured quietly. This is something rare." And for once, no one argued. The adults stepped back, lowering their heads slightly as a sign of respect. The usually noisy hum of the ship seemed to fade until only the sound of soft breathing and gentle purring remained. In that moment, something changed on the Voraan. The distance between species, the wall of language, culture, and fear, dissolved in the quiet glow of compassion. No one spoke of power or rank or difference. There was only understanding. A small human, fragile yet strong, and a group of young Predaari, fierce yet gentle, had bridged the gap that no treaty or training could have done. When the commander finally turned to leave, he paused once more and glanced back at the scene. The cubs surrounding the human, the orb glowing softly, and the faint smile on her face. For the first time in his long service, he felt proud not just of his crew, but of the heart beating within all living beings. The ship was silent, but it wasn't the silence of fear or command. It was reverence, a shared peace that words could never express. The morning after that quiet night, something had shifted on the Voraan. It wasn't visible like a light turning on or a system rebooting, but everyone could feel it. The ship felt warmer somehow, more alive. News of what had happened in Anna's cabin spread quickly, carried in whispers through the corridors and over breakfast in the mess hall. The story grew with every telling, but one thing never changed: the image of the cubs surrounding the human, comforting her as she cried. For the Predaari, who had always seen strength in control and silence, it was something they had never witnessed before. A human's tears had become something sacred, something that showed them a new kind of courage, the courage to feel. As Anna walked through the corridors that morning, she noticed the difference immediately. Normally, crew members would nod politely or move aside as she passed, their gestures respectful but distant. This time, they greeted her with soft rumbles of acknowledgement, a Predaari way of showing affection and respect. A few even lowered their heads slightly, an act once reserved for elders or commanders. The change made her uneasy at first. She wasn't sure how to react. But then one of the engineers, a tall Predaari with silver-tipped fur, stopped her near the lift and said in his deep, slow voice, "Your heart. It is strong." It wasn't a compliment she expected, but it made her smile in a way she hadn't for days. The cubs, of course, were treated like heroes. Wherever they went, the adults ruffled their fur, praised their bravery, and told them they had done something great, not by fighting or proving strength, but by showing kindness. The smallest cub, the one who had given Anna his shiny metal trinket, strutted through the halls with his chest puffed out proudly. He didn't understand all the attention, but knew it had something to do with the tiny human who now smiled again. Anna kept their gifts on a small shelf near her desk: the glowing orb, the feathered charm, the silver-threaded blanket folded neatly, and the polished piece of metal that reflected the light of distant stars. They reminded her that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. The commander, who rarely spoke about personal matters, gathered the crew that evening in the central hall. His voice echoed across the large chamber as he addressed them all. "What we witnessed," he said, "was not weakness. It was strength, the kind that unites, not divides. The human showed us her pain, and our young ones showed her our hearts. Remember this: the universe is vast and full of dangers, but no darkness can outshine the light of understanding." His words carried through the ship, sinking deep into every heart that heard them. Even those who hadn't seen what happened felt changed by it. From that day on, Anna was no longer seen as just the small human scientist among towering hunters. She became part of the Voraan family. When she worked in the lab, crew members often stopped by to bring her tea or share stories from their homeworlds. The cubs visited her daily, bringing her small treasures they found during their lessons: a smooth stone, a scrap of colored metal, or sometimes just their laughter. They called her Heart Sister, a name that made her eyes sting every time she heard it. Life on the ship didn't stop. The stars still stretched endlessly beyond the windows, and the missions continued. But something deep within the crew had changed forever. The Predaari, once seen as fearsome and distant, now carried something new in their hearts: empathy. They realized that compassion wasn't a human weakness, but a shared power, a bridge between all living beings. Late at night, when the ship drifted through quiet space, Anna would sit by her window, the soft glow of the Cub's night orb lighting her room. She often thought about that night, the gentle purring, the tiny hands offering gifts, the moment when grief had turned into connection. And as the stars glimmered beyond the glass, she would whisper softly to herself, "Even among predators, there is kindness." The Voraan continued its journey through the galaxy, carrying more than just explorers and scientists now. It carried a lesson written not in books or data, but in hearts, that the truest power in the universe isn't found in claws, strength, or speed, but in the simple courage to care.